Good day, class. Welcome to Computer Fundamentals and Programming. For this week, we will discuss about integrating JavaScript functions to HTML part 2. So the contents of this lecture is all about defining what is a loop, the conditional statements, and iterative statements. So let us first define what is a loop. So JavaScript loops are used to repeatedly run a block of code until a certain condition is met. So there are different kinds of loop in JavaScript. So we have here a for loop, while loop, for in, for off, and do while. Okay, so we have to discuss some of them, the most commonly used loops in any programming language, and that is the for loop and then the while loop. Okay, so for loop, it loops through a block of code a number of times, while the while loop loops through a block of code while a specified condition is true. So in reality, or in real life, we use for loop in, say, for example, the number of times that you could enter your credentials in a bank account. So for example, you have only 3 tries to enter your account. Okay, so after that number or chances, your account would be black and you cannot do any transactions to it for security purposes. Okay, and then the while loop, well, if the user, for example, in the game, if the user still have a life, or let's say wants to continue to play the game throughout the game, it would still repeat the game as long as the user wants to play it. Okay, so there's no definite number of times that the user would play the game or continue the game. Okay, so that's the example of for loop and while loop in real life. So that's why we are going just to um, discuss these two. So those are the once you get the idea of for loop and while loop, you would also be able to understand what are these three for. Okay, for loop. So the for loop has the following syntax. Okay, so the for keyword, and then inside is the statement 1, statement 2, and statement 3, and then inside it is the code block to be executed multiple times. Okay, so from statement 1, it is executed once before the execution of the block. So in statement 1, here we declare a variable, or we assign a value to a variable. Okay, and then in statement 2 defines the condition for executing the code block. So this is where we put how many times we run the code block. So for example, we wanted to run this code block here a number of times. So for example, 5 times, 6 times, 7 times. This is where we put the condition to control this block. And then for statement 3, is executed every time the code or block code or code block has been executed. Okay, so as long as this is true, the code block will be executed, and then it would proceed to statement 3. So this is the hierarchy, or the step-by-step procedure. This will be executed once, this condition will be checked, and if this is true, it would execute the code block and then execute the statement 3. Since this is true, it would execute the code block again and then execute the statement 3. Okay, so let us have an example. We have here the index.html and functionality.js. So let me first post the video and have a copy of these two files here. Okay, so I have here the following code, the index.html and the functionality.js. So let us first check the index.html. So it has h2, example for loop, and then the paragraph tag, which has an ID JS, and then the button, which has an ID btn1. And same goes for functionality.js. I have here the window onload, and then the variable paragraph, which would represent the element that has an ID JS, and then the b1, which has which would represent the element that has an ID, beta, and 1. And then the text variable. So this is a local variable wherein we just define this text here in our functional.js. So when defining or declaring a variable doesn't have to represent an element from a document. So we could create our own variable and then assign a value to it. So for this case, I just created a variable text that would collect all the number is here. Okay, so we have here, after the declaration of these three variables here, I have the for loop. So the for loop has three statements. The statement 1, which only execute once, and then the statement 2, which checks the condition, and then this is the code block to be repeated a number of times, and then this is the statement 3, wherein it would only execute after this code block here is finishes executing in our for loop. Okay, so in the first statement we have here the var I is equals to 0. So we define or we declare a variable I and assign value to it as 0. Okay, so this is only executed once, so the declaration of variable is most likely to be inserted here. Okay, and then the next one is the condition. So I want to loop in or I want to print this text here, or let's say not print, to collect the text here or execute this block of code here 5 times. Okay, so starting from 0, so it counts 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and once it reaches 5, it won't be executed anymore because I is equals to 5. So I should be always less than the 5. Okay, so how do we increment the value of I, or how do we add a value to I? So that's the job of statement 3. So in statement 3, we increment the value of I. So when we say increment the value of I, we increase the value of I every time the loop finishes to execute this code block here. Okay, so we declare a variable I here, assign it to 0, so I now is equals to 0. Let's check. Is I less than to 5? Since 0 is less than 5, then this is true. It would execute this code block here. After executing this code block here, it would increment the value of I by 1. So I plus plus means the value of I will be incremented by 1. So it's just like this. So I is equals to I plus 1. So I hope you still remember our algorithm, wherein this is always being discussed on the last part of the algorithm. I'm not sure if you still remember that, the loop part of our algorithm. So this is the implementation or actual implementation in programming language. So I is equals to 0 and then plus 1. So the new value of I would become 1. And then as this condition here, if it's always true, at the end of this execution of this code block, it would always increment by 1 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until it becomes false. Okay, so once this becomes false, that's the only time that this for loop would be break. Okay, and then after that, inside our implementation or the code block, we have the text here. It's stated here that it has a plus equal, then the number is, and then I, and then br. So what does it mean? So meaning to say, in our text, it is declared initially that text doesn't have a string. Okay, so on the first run, it would concatenate this text here. So the number is, what is the value of I? It's 0. Okay, we haven't executed this statement 3 yet. Okay, so the number is 0 will be inserted in our text, or it will be combined to our text. And what is our text? It's just an empty string. So after the first iteration, the value of the text would be, the number is 0. But what is this br? This br here is a tag from our HTML. So we could insert a tag in our um, string. Once we put it in here, so this tab or tag here would take effect. So what is this BR? BR tag means it is a line break. So once this code here is added to text and then the BR, meaning to say it would go to the next line. So every time that we add this text to the text variable, it would always go to the next line. Okay, and then of course the B1 that on click, it would once we click the B1 or the button, it would change the paragraph and copy the value inside the text. Okay, so let us try to check on our browser. So this is the output. So once we click the button here, it would become, or it will output, the number is 0, the number is 1, the number is 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so what if I want to print this 10 times? Okay, so once I refresh it, once I click this, it would run 10 times. So from 0 up to 9. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so 10 times. So that is for our for loop. Okay, so the next one is the while loop. So the while loop has the following syntax: while condition and then the code block to be executed. Okay, so we have here the index.html and functionality.js. So let me pause first the video and to copy this two files here. Okay, so I have here the index.html and also the functionality.js. So we didn't change anything about the implementation of the index.html, but here in functionality.js, so we just retype the codes here. So we have here the JS and then the btn1, and still the text that would contain the text that we're iterating in our loop, and then the variable I, which is equals to 0. So this time we're going to use the while loop in order to loop over this text here. Okay, so let us see. So inside the while loop is the text wherein we concatenate the text here. So after concatenating or adding it inside the value of text, it would go to the next line and then execute I++. So again, what is I++? It only increments the value of I by 1. Okay, so here's an example. So once we click it, okay, so let's try to change the value of 5. So it would become, for example, 12. So it would display 0 to 11. So different types of for loop, but different in and also different in implementation. Okay, so that's it for our loops. So the for loop is used to run a block of code number of times. So if you don't know, or if you know the how many times you want to run a loop, so we use the for loop, and then the while loop is used to run a block of code definitely. So that's the for loop and while loop for you. So let us have the if statements. So use if statements to specify a block of code to be executed if a specified condition is true. So we have a sample code here. Okay, so let us try this code. Let me pause the video first before getting this example codes here. Okay, so this is the index.html and this one is the functional.js. So I forgot to mention the file names. Okay, so I have here a copy of the index.html and functionality.js. So let us try to check. So I have here the HTML. Okay, so it has two input type, which is text, an ID text1 and text2, and then a placeholder, enter a number. Okay, and then the third one is the button, which has a type button and an ID btn1, and then of course the paragraph, which has an ID result. So it doesn't have a letter here, so we'll just replace this the value of the p inside our functionality.js. And then for the functionality.js, we have here the window on load to load our variables and functions, and then the b1 would represent the btn1 from our document, and then the answer, which has the I think that is the paragraph. So the answer variable would represent the paragraph, which has an ID result, and then the tb1 or text box 1 would represent the element txt1, or which has an ID txt1, and tb2 text box 2, which would represent the element which has an ID txt2. Okay, so from our b1 that on click, we have implemented if statements. So it says here that if tb1 that value, so we need to say we're going to get the value of tbn1, since tbn1 is a text box, so anything that the user enters, once we call the tb1 that value, that's the time that we would be able to retrieve the values on that text box. So same goes for tb2 that value. Okay, so we're going to compare these two, and then we all know that in tb1 that value, once we retrieve a value or input from the user using this text box, it is represented as a string. Okay, so in order for us to represent this as a number, we have to use the method or function parseInt. So meaning to say it would convert the value in tb1, if that's a number, into an integer. Okay, and also the parseInt for our tb2 in order for us to compare these two numbers. Okay, so if tbn1 or tb1 that value is greater than tb2 that value, so we will just display answer that inner HTML, so it access the value inside the answer into tbn1 that value plus is higher. So the plus sign here is a concatenation. So whatever the value of tbn1 or tb1 that value, it would be concatenated to the word is higher. So for example, tb1 that value is equals to 5 plus is higher, so I mean to say tbn1 or tb1, which is 5, so 5 is higher. So if this is false, this won't be executed, and then it would go to the next if statement. So the second if statement would check if this is less than, or tb1 is less than tb2. Okay, so if tb1 of this, if this is true, so I mean to say tb1 is less than tb2, then I mean to say tb2 is higher. Okay, so let us try to execute this. Okay, so I have here compare using if statements. Text box 1, this is text box 1, this is text box 2, this is the button, and then somewhere around here is the paragraph or the result variable, and then the word that you're seeing inside is the placeholder, enter a number, placeholder, placeholder. Okay, so once you click, doesn't do anything. So let's say we enter a number 23 and then 15. Okay, so once we click it, 23 is higher. So for example, this is 150. Once we click it, 150 is higher. So we're just retrieving the value inside the tb1, tb2 using that value, and then we parse the value into integer if it is convertible. Okay, so for example, if we enter a text ASD, since this cannot be represented as an integer, so once we click it, doesn't have an output. Okay, so I think there's an error on it. Let us check. So it um, doesn't display the error. Okay, so nothing's changed. Okay, so 234 is higher. Okay, so let's check the next example. So we could use else instead of two ifs. The difference is that um, if this code here, for example, we use two if statements here. If this is true, it would change the answer.html into tb1.value is higher. Okay, if this is true, and then the code would still continue to check, even though we all know in our first statement or if statement that tb1 is greater than tb2, it would still check if tb1 is less than to tb2. So we don't want to have an extra checking, since we already know in our first if statement that tb1 is greater than tb2. So we don't want to proceed on another checking, which would definitely consume another processor or another process on your computer. Okay, so in order to avoid that, we're just going to use else statement. Okay, so in else statement, we don't have to create a condition since it is an else. So I mean to say, if this becomes false automatic, it would definitely execute this. Okay, and then if this is true, it would not execute else, or it would not yes, it would not execute the else statement. Okay, so it's either this one, if statement, or this one from else statement. Okay, so it would only do the same thing. Okay, the only difference is that it's more optimal because it only executes any one of this, as long as if is true, then it would only execute the if statement. If the if is false, it would only execute else. Okay, so how about if we have 34 and 34? 34 is higher. We all know that 34 is equal to 34, so 34 is higher. A number cannot be higher than itself, right? So another one, to carry out the equal, or the case for equal, we can use an else if. Okay, so let us try this one. What is else if? Let us try this one. Okay, now so we have here the else if. So else if is used to give you another option. So for example, the first if statement is false, so it would check another condition. Okay, so if this true if here turns out to be false, that's the only time that the else statement will be executed. Okay, so you can have as many else if statement as long as you run out the memory of your computer. Okay, so you could have as many conditions, checking conditions. Okay, so the else if is located in between the if statement and the else. So else if and else could not exist without an if. Okay, but if could exist even without else if and else. And the same goes for if and else if could exist even without else. Okay, so that's it. So let us try this code here. So let us refresh. So for example, if tb1 is greater than tb2, okay, 12 is higher. Let's say this one is higher. So 112321 is higher. And then how about if they are equal? So it's equal. Okay, so I hope that you were able to get the idea of the if statements. Okay, so that's all for our module 14 or unit 14. I hope you learned something new. I think this is also part of the exam wherein you have to check the credentials of the user. So you could control or you could retrieve the username or user ID of the user using the dot value, and then check if it is one of the details inside our JSON file. So JSON will be we will be discussing JSON and arrays on our next module. Thank you and God bless.